Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar, Core Team Leading Skills, Session 3, Negotiating a Tough Crowd. Our presenter today is Nicole Nash-Arnold. Nicole is a nursing career coach who helps great nurses transform into respected leaders. She shares her 15 years of experience in both senior and executive health leadership roles to germinate great leadership. Clinically, Nicole has over 10 years perioperative experience before moving into her nursing educator and management roles. She has postgraduate qualifications in perioperative nursing and currently a master's in nursing. Nicole is a member of the International Coaches Federation. Nicole, welcome to the microphone.
Thanks very much, Sue. So today what we're going to run through is one of the other core skills of team leading, and that is the art of negotiating. Now, negotiating takes many a form, and unless we know how to do this well, it turns out one of two ways. And that way is that we get walked over and the outcome is entirely your opponent's way, or we have short tempers and we flare up and end up having a raging scrap with someone in the middle of the nurse's station because they were being so entirely unreasonable. So this webinar that we're going through today is talking about the art of negotiating. It's never easy, it's always confrontational, and it's always uncomfortable. But the very skilled negotiators are excellent at developing techniques for being able to have both parties walk away with what they want from the negotiating. Now, that's not always a win-win. So it's not always compromise and it's not always a great solution, but sometimes it's what you want given the situation. And we'll talk about that a little bit further about when to negotiate and when not to negotiate. So that's what I hope to do for you today, is talk to you about some styles, some models of negotiation. We're going to define the things that you need to prepare before. We're going to talk about when, where and how to negotiate, and the top mistakes that I think nurses make when they engage in negotiation. So we'll kick off right there actually with the top mistakes that nurses make, because sometimes when you know what you've done wrong in negotiations before, it makes it easier in future to work out what you can do right. And the most common mistake that I think people make is not building those relationships. Now, when I say that, I mean that it's all about, these negotiations is all about healthy relationships that you have from the get-go. You need good relationships with people in your team so that you can leverage the goodwill. If you walk into a negotiation cold, then sometimes it is very difficult to predict your opponent's wishes, desires, outcomes, what they want from the negotiation and what they're willing to concede. And I guess I'd better be clear about some of the things that I think you might be negotiating. So we're taking this from the context of when you are in a ward situation, say, and you're a new team leader. And the things that you need to negotiate are many things. They might be, and the common one is when people are going to go to tea and whether they're going to do it on time. Patient allocations, taking on the responsibility of students. If you're in a team nursing situation, then you're navigating people that don't necessarily want to work together, but you're going to make them work together for the greater good. You may be negotiating with patients or their relatives when they are unhappy. You may be negotiating with surgeons and doctors and how they want things to be done, which may or may not suit you. Specialty areas like the operating theatre in my background, for example, as a team leader, negotiation is a core business. You are sitting there in front of a whiteboard with your whiteboard marker and negotiating constantly. Who's going where, who's scrubbing for what surgeons are going into what rooms, what theatres you're going to abandon for the emergency that you've just been called about. There are loads of things that you need to be negotiating. And if you walk into that without a relationship that's pre-existing with any of those people, you're going to struggle to get an outcome. Number one, because you don't have goodwill with them. And number two, it's hard to predict what they want. You have to crawl inside their head so that you can navigate a good outcome. You need to do some little bit of predicting and, I won't lie, a bit of manipulation in this so that you can work out a win-win situation. So all of those skills, about all of the pre-work that you do, about the good relationships that you've got with people, that you use your emotional intelligence, that your culture and your environment your clinical environment is good, that your communication skills are really sharp, all hinge on these relationships. And if they're poor, then you're behind the 8 ball to start with. Second, and this is one that I struggled with in my early nursing leadership, was fear of offending. I don't like confrontation. I avoid it at all cost. I avoid it personally. I avoid it professionally. And one of the main reasons was I was a fear of offending people. I had a fear of stepping on their toes. I had a fear of when I was in charge as a junior team leader that I had to go up to someone who had 20 years of experience and start telling them what to do. I was uncomfortable with that. So trying to find the best deal for myself or what I was trying to achieve or my team was overwhelming for me. And I was worried about saying the wrong thing to the wrong person, going in too early, asking for the wrong things in this. If I was, for example, trying to work out who was going to go and scrub for the emergency list, I had a real problem with going up and saying, can you finish what you're doing now and going into this theatre? People didn't want to do that. They wanted to stay and have a nice long afternoon tea and saunter back to their theatre and slowly put their stuff away and head home. But I had to go in and go, no, change that plan. This is what you're doing now. And I didn't want to do it because I was worried I was offending them. So all of those things, even if I did say that to them and then they said no, then what was I going to do about it? So I had to address those things about and overcome that fear of offending people or stepping up and owning my space in that negotiation. I had to remember that it wasn't an argument I was having with them. I was trying to achieve something that was best for the patient, and that was the aim for me. And because we both wanted different things, then I had to have a discussion, not an argument, not a confrontation. It wasn't a conflict. It was a discussion about what I wanted and what they wanted and the where to from here. But that, of all of the 7 mistakes that I'm going to run through now, that was the one that I struggled with most. Now, the third one a lot of people do is not listening. Now, how many times have you observed in a fly on the wall situation, a negotiation that quickly flicked from negotiation to confrontation, and the emotions were allowed to enter into that negotiation, and then people started to get angry, and once you're angry, it's really hard to communicate with your neocortex. So then this negotiation completely derailed. Now the problem was about the argument that people had and not the very nature of what they were trying to negotiate. So to be a successful negotiator, you have to have sharp, disciplined listening skills where you don't let the emotion enter that conversation or your internal dialogue because it derails it faster than anything. And so as opposed to the people who on one end of the negotiating continuum get walked all over, which was me with my fear of offending, as opposed to the other who ends up railroading people and ends up in a confrontation, this is the reason for not listening for the other end of that continuum, where people fail to deploy those things that we use and have been in service on ad nauseum throughout our nursing careers: active listening, paraphrasing, empathetic listening, all of those concepts that we have been told about so many times. This is where it has to be deployed and has to be incredibly disciplined around how you do that. Because you have a very firm idea of what someone wants, but often the other party's idea is not something that you have to dismiss and may be a good solution, or a good point that you hadn't considered. So really being disciplined is important. Now this next one is something that most people haven't really considered that's really important in a negotiation, and it's referred to in a number of different ways, but most commonly fallback position. The best way to describe this is if you're going to buy a house and the house is listed at $500,000 and you think, well, that's where we're starting, but I won't pay 500, but I might pay 480, but no more than that. I might go up to 490. So 490 in a way is your fallback position. Your ideal is 480,000, but your fallback position is 490. Equally, if you're the one selling for 500,000, then you're going to list it at 500,000. There's no way you're going to take 480, but you've said to yourselves, well, I might take 490. So each of you have had a fallback position that happens to collide. Now, sometimes the mistake made by not having a fallback position is that it's an all or nothing, which is a problem because it leaves you nowhere to go. If you are absolutely hard and fast at 480 and they're absolutely hard and fast at 500, then there's no room for negotiation. So before you go in, you need to have this negotiation. You need to have considered what your fallback position. The other thing is that it's often referred to as a best alternative to a negotiated agreement. Now, your negotiated agreement would ideally be 480, but what is your next best alternative to that? Ideal 480, what's next? And what's a no-go? The concept of the BATNA, the best alternative to a negotiated agreement, is a concept out of a book called Getting to Yes, Negotiating Agreement Without Giving In, and it is an exceptional book. So if your role, for whatever reason, is something that hinges on excellent negotiating skills, then that's definitely the book for you. And he really unpacks that notion of BATNA in that book. But essentially, it gives you the luxury of being able to push harder in your negotiating because you know where you're going to go next. You've got somewhere to go and it's not win or lose. Now, number 5 is an assumption, which is the death of many a thing, but it is also a death about a non-negotiable of a negotiation. And it is the assumption that you're going in thinking that this is a non-negotiable, which is not the case. Almost everything is negotiable. In fact, I think the phrase is everything's for sale. Sometimes you might go in and think, I've been given 2 more patients from the after-hours coordinator and from the emergency department, and I have to find them beds. I've got 5 beds, but I don't have enough staff really for the patients that I've got. But you assume that it's a non-negotiable that you take 2 because the coordinator's rung and has said to you, you have to, there's nowhere else to put them. So then you go and you make it work, even though you may consider it unsafe, you may consider it incredibly unfair. You look at your staff, you realise you're going to have some pretty unhappy people around you, but you never entered into a negotiation to start with because you assumed that the coordinator was going to say a categorical no. But in fact, it's very possible that there are many an alternative. Perhaps you'll take one of the 2. Perhaps you'll take one now and one in 2 hours' time. Perhaps you'll take one and the ward down the road can take the other one and you'll take one of their self-carers. So and then if you pitch that to them and they go, yeah, okay, we'll let AD keep one for 2 hours and you take the first one. But you've made an assumption that it was a non-negotiable and so you never even had the conversation. So that's a common mistake that people make. Number 6 is coupled really with the BATNA and the not knowing what your fallback position is, and it's giving an ultimatum. So if we're going to use the house analogy, then you are saying to them, I'll pay $480 and not $1 more. If you don't want to take $480, then I'm walking away from the negotiating table. It's an ultimatum. The problem with this is there's nowhere for the discussion to go. And the worst thing, the greatest mistake you can make in a negotiation is shutting the door, because you're assuming then it's a non-negotiable, and everything's a negotiable. Everything's negotiable. So giving an ultimatum is an absolute no-go. Walking up to a nurse and saying, you will take these 2 patients and you will take them now, or what? Or you'll be disciplined, or you can leave the shift, or, there are lots of ors you could be giving people, but you are forcing their hand to say, but what if I could take one and someone else could take the other? Once you enter an ultimatum, you immediately flick it into a confrontation and you close the door for discussion. So the minute the ultimatum is delivered, that's the end. The negotiation is finished and now you're in confrontation. So it's not a door that you ever want to close. Sometimes there are some really good alternatives to an ultimatum if you're getting close to that point. What some incredibly skilled, sharp negotiators can do is they will provide some time limits, perhaps. Like, I will give you some time to think about how you can reallocate your patient load so that you can take these 2 patients. And then you put the pressure on them to come up with some solutions. That encouragement for the other party to reach a decision can break a deadlock. So it's a really powerful way of quietly giving an ultimatum without closing the door and putting the pressure on someone else to make the decision. And ultimately, it's failing to prepare. Like most things in life, if you fail to spend some time in doing some preparation, it's destined to fail. So taking some time before you enter the negotiation is absolutely critical. And we'll go through why in a moment. But what a lot of people do is get off the phone from the coordinator, know that there's 2 patients, walk straight up and go, the only obvious solution is this nurse will take them because she's got the lightest load in the ward. Bang, there you go, given your ultimatum, no discussion, that's what's going to happen. And it's flicked into a confrontation. If you'd spent some time perhaps thinking about what we're going to talk about next, then the conversation that you will have will be very, very different from this is a directive, not a conversation, and you will come up with some very creative solutions. So to that end, preparation. Let's unpack preparation a little bit. Take some time before you enter that negotiation and start to think. What are you trying to achieve during the negotiation? And what do you think the other person's goals are or will be? So, for example, if you're reallocating patient loads and you're giving nurses extra patients, your goal is to safely take as many patients as you can. Because after all, you have empty beds and you have to think about what the hospital needs. We offer a health service, and when you have empty beds, then you have a duty of care to avail those to patients who need them. Otherwise, we end up with full emergency departments and ramped ambulances. And we all know how that story goes. So if you've got empty beds, it is incumbent upon you in that team leading role to use them, provided it's safe. So your goal in this negotiation is to accept the patient, provided it's safe. The other person's goal is quite different to that. Their goal is to maintain their status quo. They've already got their workload. They've planned out their day. They know what they've got. They've got their, say, 4 patients, and you're about to give them a 5th, possibly a 6th, if you can. And so now you're in a situation where they don't want that. They want to keep the status quo. So it's important to think about that. From it's obvious that they're going to, but why is it? Why do they want that? Is it because they're at maximum capacity, or is it because they're expending about 50% of their energy and they're enjoying that and it's a nice day? It makes for a nice day, but they've still got a fair bit of capacity if they used it. So think about what your goals are, what their goals are. The next thing to think about is trades. What might you be able to ask or give away or ask for? What can the other party offer you? So in this situation, what they can offer you is one of their self-caring patients that you could look after while you're team leading, or you could give them one of the two patients you need to bed and reallocate someone else's. Or they may be someone who is very motivated for overtime and you know it. So you could say, look, if you need to stay back, then that would be fine because you know them. You've built the relationship with them. You know they're actually very keen. They're going on holidays in a couple of weeks overseas. They'd actually like a couple of hours overtime for extra cash. So it might be a situation where you may have that up your sleeve. Alternatively, they might be quite the opposite, where they want to get out the minute that they can. So perhaps what you can offer them is, I'll ring the night duty and get them to come on a couple of hours early, and then you take them now and then head off early. That might be something. Then they take a couple of hours leave without pay. So there are lots of things that is within your capacity as a team leader to be able to use as a trade. Perhaps they want a shift swap with you in a couple of weeks' time because you've covered off that first mistake, which is building relationships. So you know them well enough to know what's in it for them. Alternatives. If you cannot reach your goals, what would be your next best alternative to the negotiated agreement? What's your BATNA? Your position will be much more secure if you have another number of options. So it's worth putting in the time to really think about this and spending for 5 or 10 minutes. Now, when I was after hours coordinating in a very, very large, in fact, one of the largest private hospitals in Australia, an after hours coordinator's job is nothing but negotiating. And so we would go to team leaders who are already busy and stressed and have to ask them to take patients, which is why I use this example so much, because it's common. It's easy to imagine it happening in most of our hospitals. And so understanding what my alternatives were important because I needed my BATNA. If I went up to a team leader that I was pretty sure could take two, and I considered what my goals were, which was offload the 2 ED patients, I considered what I'd be able to trade with them. But my alternative was, well, worst comes to worst, I can always put one in ICU overnight and leave the other one in ED. It wasn't a terrible plan. It wasn't a great plan either, but it was my BATNA. It was the best alternative. So it meant for me that it removed the emotion out of it, where I wasn't desperate to get this deal done because it's the only one I've got. So if it didn't work out, I walked away and thought, well, plan B. You've got to have your plan B. Otherwise, it's really easy to move into, when you're not listening to people, flick it into a confrontation, deliver an ultimatum, and then you've closed the door on a negotiation and find yourself in the middle of a confrontation. You are always at risk with that. When I was doing a negotiating course years ago with a very skilled international litigator who had done a lot of work for the UN, and he was one of Australia's leading litigation experts, he said to us during this week-long course on negotiating, he said, you always negotiate and concede more than you mean to. And I thought that was interesting for someone who did this for a living, felt like he used his BATNA more often than he had ever hoped to. So if someone that skilled, that experienced and that renowned in negotiation and litigation says your fallback position, you find yourself more often than not, then it's probably worth considering always having one. Next is the relationship. Now, of course, one of the mistakes that we make is not having a pre-existing relationship with individuals. But in terms of preparation, the relationship is considering how have negotiations worked in the past and what kind of relationship do you want with them in the future. Now that's important for when we decide which strategy we're going to use in our negotiations. So I'll talk about that a little bit later, but just keep that in the back of your mind. How's it gone in the past? important research for you really, whether it's been you that's been involved in the negotiation or you've observed other people being involved in the negotiation. The question is for you, how did that go? Did they flare up instantly in an aggression? Because a lot of people do that to force your hand out of the negotiation. So it might be not necessarily something that is part of their personality, but just bully is the wrong word, but that's a strategy that they use to remove themselves from the negotiation. So that's important research for you to reflect on, how they behave in negotiations. But the important question, which I'll hold over to a couple of slides in the future, is what do you want the relationship to be with them in the future? Next, expected outcomes. What precedents have been set? And based on that, what seems your most likely outcome? Now, is asking a nurse to take another 2 patients on your ward something that's incredibly unheard of, and therefore they'll look at you like you have 15 heads and just be like, are you serious? We don't do that. Asking a nurse, for example, in an intensive care to take 2 ventilated patients at once is unheard of. Now, they might do it a lot overseas and in other countries, but we don't very often do it here, if ever. I've never come across it where we've taken 2 ventilated patients. So if you, for some reason, decided in your negotiation that on this one occasion you would approach that nurse to see if she could take 2 ventilated patients, you're probably on a hiding to nowhere on that one. And the precedent has been long set and long established that that's not going to happen. So therefore, what's the likely outcome? A raging no, I would expect. However, if you're on the ward and your acuity is such that nurses may take anywhere from 4 to 6, and on this particular day the nurse in question has got 4, so it wouldn't be unreasonable to consider him or her taking 4 up to 6, then the precedent has been set that it does happen. So think about that in terms of how unusual it is what you're asking for. Not to say that you shouldn't ask, although on the LCU one you probably wouldn't. It just will frame the way you approach it. Consequences is something to consider. Is this a one-off negotiation that you're going to make, or one of many small negotiations? In a nursing situation, one of many small negotiations is patient allocations. You're going to be negotiating patient allocations in the team role for the term of your team leading life. So this is one of many. So it's important to establish how you do this, because it's going to be quite reflective on your future in how you do handle negotiations. However, if it's a one-off, for example, if I had been asked in my coordinator role to take a patient from Toowoomba and we're in Brisbane and I was negotiating that would be a very rare situation. Not unheard of, but pretty rare. So I was in the middle of a one-off and the consequences of that in a way were less important. There were other things to consider like reputation, those sorts of things, the relationship, what the hospital expected me. But in terms of consequences, it wasn't going to be as impactful on me from a day-to-day as the outcome of this one will. Because in a way you're setting up a precedent here of how you're engaging as a team leader. Are you able to step up and get people to do what you want when you want them to do it? Or are you going to fade away and in your fear of offending, be walked all over a little bit? So it's important to understand what you stand to gain and what you stand to lose by the outcome of this negotiation. And solutions. Creatively brainstorming in your own head for 5 minutes before you start the negotiation is really important. What do you consider a fair outcome? What are all of those? What are all of the possible things? So that's what we've done. We've identified what our mistakes are. We acknowledge those elephants in the room where we tend to make those mistakes. We've been asked to enter a negotiation in our role as a team leader, and we consider those 6 things. about how we prepare. We just take 5 minutes, perhaps in the tea room, perhaps in the nurse manager's office. If you're on a late shift, for example, you can just spend 5 minutes running through those things. And then we have to choose the way in which we're going to approach this. So we've decided we're in. How are we going to do it? There are some options for you, and it's not just head-to-head, which is a mistake a lot of people often make. So to start with, on the left-hand side of this axis, we've got the importance of the relationship, which is the part I said to you earlier that I was going to hold over until this slide now. So we've got relationship importance going up. So it's either very low in importance or very, very high. And then the outcome importance, that it's low or if it's high. So we're going to plot now what options we have in terms of how we engage in this negotiation according to, on one hand, the relationship importance, and on the other hand, the outcome importance. Now this model is a matrix called the Lewicki and Haynes negotiation matrix, and they have actually come up with 5 options for you. Now if the relationship importance is low and the outcome importance is low, then a very good option for you is avoidance. Now, you wouldn't necessarily think that is a negotiating technique, but in fact it is a very real option for you, and it's a very sound one. It's not burying your head in the sand if you've decided that the relationship is unimportant and the outcome is unimportant. So, for example, an easy example, if we take it out of the clinical environment, is if you own a shop and someone comes in and they're returning a $5 thing, and you know that they're from interstate and they can have no impact on your shop's reputation, and $5 doesn't matter to you either way, you can pop your little headphones on and completely ignore them all you like. There is absolutely nothing in it for you, and there is no loss. So it is, put simply, it is just not worth getting into a conflict over this situation. So you can either withdraw from the negotiation permanently or temporarily, or avoid the situation altogether. So for example, in a clinical setting, you might have a patient who has made a comment about the tissue that they've popped underneath the sink in the room, in the private room, that they've noticed for 5 days now when they've been visiting their husband that tissue has been there. Now, in a way, that relationship is not unimportant, but it's definitely down here. And the outcome is relatively unimportant, arguably. And so you could avoid that. It is not worth getting into a conflict. If you've read that this lovely old duck is just having a little bit of a dig and that's what she does, and she's not exactly going to go to the minister over a little piece of toilet paper underneath the sink, and what's the risk? Toilet paper, if it was a bloody sponge, then that would be something different, but a tissue, not so much. So you could argue you could safely avoid that in its entirety and just let it go through to the keeper. Sometimes you can use avoidance strategy when the other person is emotional or very angry. Now, it's important to take care of your own emotions and keep them in check. But if it's the other person that's very upset, then you can use avoidance temporarily to let the situation simmer down, let them start communicating with their neocortex again, and then have a rational conversation with them. So at that time, you've valued the relationship a little bit more, but you're using the avoidance technique just as a little stay of execution. So that would be a reasonable use of avoidance temporarily. But sometimes the relationship just doesn't matter, the outcome just doesn't matter, so you ignore it. However, if the outcome now, you've had a look at it and you're like, yeah, the relationship doesn't matter at all, but the outcome, getting my way, this is really, really important, but the relationship doesn't matter, but the outcome does, then you're in competition. So then you have to use the strategies around that, and we'll unpack that model in a little bit. But sometimes it's about you win, they lose. Come hell or high water. That's the way it has to be. So, for example, you might be dealing with someone from another hospital, and it's a hospital along the way, and that team leader has contacted you, or the hospital coordinator for some reason has contacted you and is demanding that you keep your patient that could be discharged, but you have to keep them for another week because they simply don't have a bed, and then it's the weekend and it's a public holiday and it simply won't matter. And so it's absolutely not convenient for them whatsoever, so you'll need to keep the patient for a long, long time. Now, the outcome for you is important. You're a heavy, busy ward that needs beds, and your bed turnover is fast, and having someone self-caring with no reason to be there in the bed is simply not going to happen. And they're a random from another hospital. In fact, they're being transported via air ambulance to goodness knows where. So your relationship with this individual is entirely unimportant. So we go low here, high here. Now we're in negotiation mode, in competition. I want to win. I don't care what you lose. It's going to happen. It's best when used acknowledging the fact that your relationship with this individual will be over at the end of this negotiation. So this situation is not dissimilar to when we buy a house or we buy a car in our personal lives. It doesn't matter what the car owner thinks about you after you've bought the car. You don't expect to have the relationship with them. So the relationship there is an absolute 0 out of 10. But the outcome, you paying the least you possibly can, is important. Also a good one for when someone else represents another party, because the relationship with that individual becomes less important. You might say EBA negotiations is a good example of that, where the relationship with your relationship with the hospital, obviously your employer, is important, but that's why we engage unions to negotiate on behalf of us, because they don't really care about the relationship with the hospital. It's a nice to have a good relationship, but if they don't, then that's okay. But the outcome, getting the best possible deal for their constituents, is of importance. So hence we have a competitive strategy around the way in which we negotiate EBAs. Now, as the next example, we've considered the outcome is of no relevance, but the relationship is of absolute relevance. So now we've scored low here, high here. Now we accommodate. This is a situation where you lose and they win. Often not something we really consider when we are thinking about negotiation, where you lose and you win. But that's why it's important when we talked about taking some time, and one of the mistakes you make is failing to prepare, take some time out to consider what you want. What are your goals? And if the relationship is the goal, and having a good relationship for moving forward and being able to negotiate with them moving forward, not setting precedent and showing that you can then, and that you can work with this person, then you win something later, but just not today. You've lost the battle, but you'll win the war. That's when you deploy the accommodation, where you lose and they win. So it's important to remember that it's not necessarily about you losing. Just maybe you lose this one. You can accommodate in the short term in exchange for a long-term gain. But before you enter an accommodation, confirm the relationship is actually substantially more important than the outcome. So if this is the case, then you need to build trust, and you need to make sure that your intentions are clear. Make sure the other person understands why you're giving up your interests. I'll take the patient we're taking from ED and get rid of the other one because I can see you're tired. I can see you're stressed. I can see you're not coping. That's the point where you go, okay, I won't give you 2 patients. In fact, I won't give you any, but this is why I'm doing this for you. This is why I'm giving up my interests and making my evening harder for you. You win, I lose, this is why. Otherwise, you're in a situation where you are potentially on the side of the negotiation where you get walked all over in future. Now, the fourth one is where the relationship has to be maintained, the outcome has to be maintained, and we're in collaborate. This is where you need to work together, come hell or high water on this one, where you are both happy. Collaboration is often best when there are some very undesirable outcomes for the other person and both parties are fighting over a small win in a way. With collaboration, you can both work together to provide a much larger win. Now, collaborate, for example, in our situation where you've got these two patients from ED, might be a situation where you as a team leader take one and they take one. Or you collaborate by working on them both, or you work together to reallocate all of the patients that they have, which is probably more accurate of collaboration actually. You sit down with the 4 patients that they've got already, with the 2 patients they're going to get, and you collaborate together without you being the owner of the decision. You actually come together, get their input, and you both work out a solution together. That's collaboration. They give some ideas, you put forward the problems why that's not going to work, you slowly massage things until you both find a way around it. It is inherently important that you have trust and rapport with that other person, otherwise they're going to be looking at your solutions with suspicion. It's important that you openly disclose your intentions and why and your rationales, so that that trust can create that bond and you can openly work together. Now, your reputation is really important in this one. That's why we're so high in the relationship part of the continuum. So if you want a relationship that is built on fairness, honesty, integrity and rapport moving forward, then you have to do this with complete openness and say, this is my problem, I understand your problems, and you work together and you build a solution around consensus where you are both owners of the decision. Now, the fifth way is somewhere in the middle where relationship is important, outcome is important, and compromise. So that's probably the compromise where you come up with a solution, I'll take one, you two one. Essentially, compromise is we split it in the middle. So if I won't negotiate on my house, selling my house at 500, and you won't negotiate and pay any more than 480, then the compromise is we split the difference and pay 490. So it's not necessarily based on something where other factors are considered, and it can only happen when the outcome is balanced with the relationship, and so you are happy to accept that and split the difference. But there are often much more factors to be considered in the middle, so it's very difficult to find a place at the point at which you can use compromising. Now, it's important to stay very flexible. If you're in the middle of a compromise, you're going to gain and lose. This is both a win and lose situation. The last thing you wanted was to take a patient while you were team leading. But in the interests of maintaining the outcome and saying yes to the coordinator and the relationship with this particular nurse, then you're going to do it. So it's not a win, it's not a lose, it's just splitting the difference. So you have to understand your goals. And if it's a situation where the intention was to show that you're not being walked over, but you'll just pick up the pieces, that may not be acceptable to you. That's why you have to spend that time preparing. Was this your best alternative to a negotiated agreement? And if it wasn't, and you're just picking up the pieces, then you've not lost the battle to win the war. You're just picking up the pieces. So compromise sounds wonderful, as does collaboration, but it's not always in your best interest. So you've really got to be sure that this is what you want. So avoidance is easy. We just turn off and withdraw. Accommodate is easy. You say whatever, they win completely. Compromise is generally easy, although not the easiest, in that we just split the difference. What's harder is the win-win, and that's the collaboration. And to do that well, then you need to really work through the problem identification. What do you want to get out of this negotiation? If you're going to actually sit down and you're both going to be the decision makers, you're going to relinquish full control over this process and you're going to hand it off to someone else, you have to be really clear about your goal. You have to have done your work before to prepare, to identify what you are able to trade and what your alternatives are and what the relationship is. You need to sit and work out some solutions. This is, hopefully when you've prepared, you've thought about some alternatives, you've thought about your BATNA, but now you need to give them some time to say, well, what are some solutions? Brainstorming, actually sitting down with collaborating with someone is solution generation. Just throwing out some ideas about how we can best manage that. Could we put this patient down into another ward? Maybe I'll write that down as an option to a coordinator. Could someone else in the ward take this patient? No, because blah, blah, blah. Could we take one? Just brainstorm all of the solutions and then you together select. That's how you collaborate to ensure that you maintain the relationship and you maintain the outcome. For you, if you've identified your goals, which is these two patients have to come into this ward, how are we going to manage it? I want it to be you, but if you don't think it should be you, let's work out the problem. I have to take the patients, that's my problem. And they will say, I don't have the capacity. Right, what are we going to do? Generate a whole stack of ideas, then you both select the solution. That's how you collaborate with someone. The win-lose is a little harder. And when you step into a win-lose situation where you have to win and they have to lose, then this is where negotiation gets tough, and this is why it has a bit of a bad rap. It's a part of the one negotiation style that makes you feel a little ill because it is tough. It is the one that you use when you're buying a car and buying a house. But that's easy because you never have to see those people again. If you're engaged in a win-lose situation, in a situation at work, then it's hard to really see a situation where you don't care about the relationship. Even if it's with the after-hours coordinator, you do care. If you're a team leader, you care very much about your relationship with the after-hours coordinator because your life is going to be very difficult without a good relationship with that person. Or with your nurse unit manager, it's going to be very difficult to have a decent relationship without your nurse unit manager. It's going to be very difficult if you have engaged with people outside the hospital, even when they don't really, you're not going to see them again, you do represent the hospital. So it's going to be hard for you just to be buying a house, come what may, I don't care about you and I'm going to win and you're going to lose, because it will reflect badly on the hospital you represent. But, however, we will, for the purpose of this, use the example of the enterprise bargaining agreement. The union act on our behalf to negotiate our enterprise agreement. And we do that for this reason, because they step into our stead so that we don't have to worry about the relationship. And so then it becomes quite clear. You need a targeted outcome, just like when you're buying a house. The hospital want to pay only a 2% pay rise and the union come in and say, no, 6. So you start with that target price. This is essentially distributive bargaining and it's competitive. So the unions listed a price, the hospitals listed a price, so we've got a starting point and a target outcome. And then we've got, somewhere in the middle, we've got the resistant point. This is the point beyond which the negotiator will go. So the hospital may be thinking, well, I'm not going above 3.5%. And the union are thinking, we're not going below 4. So then we have these the negotiation is actually not about 2.5, about 6. It's actually about 0.5% in the middle. So it's really important to recognise that there is a resistant point. And the purpose of the negotiation conversation is trying to narrow that so that we can understand what the actual resistance point is, whether we've got an overlap or whether we've got a gap. So then the opening offer, and it goes from there. Then there's the starting position that we open with. The hospital says 2.5, the union says 6, and off we go. But the targeted outcome is an option. Now, at some point, both of them will have a BATNA, and that is essentially 3.5 for the hospital and 4% for the union. And so then the objective from distributive situation is finding a settlement point upon both which you can agree. And each party wants to get as big a proportion of that bargaining range as possible. Yeah, that bargaining range is at 0.5%. And it's about who's going to win more of it. But you're never going to go into the negotiation knowing what that is. And just how much people will concede, of course, depends on those things that we've talked about. The relationship and how much preparation that people have done, identifying what goals each party has, all of those things, and avoiding those mistakes. There are some intangibles that are so important. If you find yourself in a situation where you're distributive bargaining for some reason, where you absolutely have to win and the other party has to lose, maybe it's a situation where the coordinator has called you and said you'll have to take 6 patients, and you know that that's absolutely impossible, and there has been no opportunity to say, could we only take 3, and that has been a no. So before you enter a win-lose situation, you have to consider what value do you place on your reputation in this situation. Now, your reputation means with your coordinator and with your staff. If you're going to walk into your staff and say, no, we've got to take 6 patients, you might have a mutiny on your hands, and your reputation is going to take a hit as a team leader who can negotiate. So you need to consider that reputation as well as that with your coordinator. You have to consider, will striking a hard bargain win you more respect from your opponent, from your employer, from your team? There's every possibility that the coordinator, and I know as a coordinator just quietly I would ring people and go, I know she'll say yes, so I'll just give them a call because it'll be heaps easier than ringing the tough negotiator in Ward X, Y and Z. I'll avoid that. So if you strike a hard bargain and enter this competitive strategy, you may actually be one of those people that the coordinator thinks, oh God, all right, I'll avoid that for a while because that's too hard, because they will really give me a run for my money in negotiating. So sometimes it's worth it. You have to make that assessment. If you're going to go into a win-lose situation in a clinical situation, are you setting a precedent? A good one, perhaps. A bad one, perhaps. If you take the 6 patients because you didn't enter a win-lose competitive distributive bargaining negotiating cycle, are you setting a precedent now that you'll just take them? Very, very possibly. Are you likely to have ongoing negotiations with this party? Almost certainly in your role, who you're negotiating with, you're going to. So you have to consider what sort of relationship you're setting up around negotiating. Do you have certain principles that you won't compromise? Now, patient advocacy is clearly one. You are not going to put your patient advocacy principle at risk just by winning or losing. So that constitutes something to consider. And is time a factor? How much time do you have to have this battle? If a patient's deteriorating and you're having a scrap about whether they're going to go to ICU or not, then it's ridiculous. You have no time for that negotiation. It has to be quicker, and this isn't the time for a win-lose distributive bargaining session. But if you have plenty of time and, no one's dying right now, then you've got time to, if you really decide that it's worth it to go through this competitive strategy, then you should. So that's what we've covered today. We've gone through what the mistakes are. Consider where your mistake is out of those 7 that we discussed and what you can do. Is it just preparation? Most of the mistakes that we covered like not building relationships and fear of offending and not listening and fallback positions will be covered off in your preparation as you consider what goals you want to make, what trades and alternatives you have at your disposal, what are the expected outcomes and the consequences of this, and what are the solutions. And then using all of that, choosing a strategy, whether it's avoidance or accommodate. Sometimes you lose the battle to win the war, or you collaborate and you relinquish control over the decision making to get the outcome that you both need, or you go hammer and tong and absolutely go for it, or you split the difference and you compromise. But ultimately, the goal is to use one of those strategies so that you can deploy some level of confidence around what you're negotiating in your team leader role. As usual, I've got some things up there on the negotiation at my website for you to have a look at and read a little bit more about that model of Lewis and Hems, which is negotiation matrix, which is really useful to remember how important is the outcome, how important is the relationship, so that you can, as you become more and more skilled at being a crafty negotiator.
Nicole, as usual, a fabulous presentation. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Management is such a complex area, isn't it?
Yes, there's lots of things to think about and consider and sort of deploy all at the same time that are often incredibly interlinked.
Yeah, amazing. And when you start to unpack it, you realise the skills that you don't have.
Yeah.
Or do have, one or the other.
Well, something where you think it doesn't really matter what this person thinks about me, and then you realise that, your reputation or your goodwill now relies on getting a good outcome, and you think, oh, geez, I should have spent more time in the tea room with them.
Yes, that's right. I should have had a few more conversations with that person.
Yeah.
Nicole, thank you very much. And as Nicole said, she does have a fabulous website, and there are an enormous amount of resources available to you. And I would recommend that you go and have a squiz. Nicole, thank you very much for a great presentation.
Absolute pleasure.
To everyone who's listening, I wish you an absolutely exceptional day, and I look forward to seeing you online at another webinar very soon. Goodbye.